Hey all. So I'm going to be talking about China's vulnerability collection system. This was co-authored with Kristen Del Rosso. She couldn't make it today. I actually live here, and so it was quite an easy commute for me. If you need food recommendations afterwards, happy to talk about that. This paper was put out through the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. We're a think tank in DC. I sell my labor through SentinelOne, so that is the people who pay me a salary, but this particular bit of research went out through this think tank. You can find Kristen and I on Twitter at our handles there. We're a big fan of pandas. So what's the deal with China? The bottom line up front is that China has effectively created a hot leads desk for offensive teams when it comes to the exploitation of software vulnerabilities that are collected through their vulnerability systems. But let's go back to the beginning, before 2021. China had two existing systems, CNVD and CNNVD, and that's going to annoy the crap out of you the entire session. The one with one N, the shorter, is a vulnerability system run by China CERT. CNNVD, the one that is longer, is run by the Civilian Intelligence Services, the Ministry of State Security. CVE, we're all familiar with, and these do not match up. So if you can see here on the right-hand side is the CNNVD. This is a voluntary database that receives vulnerability submissions from researchers and companies, most of them operating inside of the PRC. Those vulnerabilities make their way into the CNNVD database, which is managed by the 13th Bureau of the Ministry of State Security. It's known publicly as CNITSEC. You can see the naming convention on there. It's also will be in the slides that are accessible to you. And those vulnerabilities make their way to offensive hacking teams. We know that because of 2017 reporting by Recorded Future, who analyzed the data put out by the CNNVD database. They noticed that vulnerabilities were being submitted. They were not being published for some number of days. And they knew that because of the naming convention. And so what they did was they mapped up the naming convention of the dates for vulnerabilities submitted to that database. And then they went back and they said, what observed vulnerabilities have been exploited by Chinese hacking teams? And do those vulnerabilities match with the CNNVD naming conventions that have been withheld? And the answer was yes. So you could see the delay in publication between submission in the database, how they were named in CNNVD, and then them being utilized by offensive hacking teams. CNNVD wiped the data from their page after that report went public. And so now all the data has been obfuscated in some capacity. On the left-hand side is the one run by China CERT. So we're familiar with what CERTs do. This is China's national version of that. They're actually a participant in FIRST. They're one of the members. And they had a kind of a multifaceted vulnerability collection system. They received inputs from researchers, but they also had partner institutions. They had 3 partner databases you can see here in the middle: Butian database, Shanghai Jiaotong, and Vulnbox. Butian and Vulnbox are both for-profit bug bounty programs. So researchers, academics, et cetera, could submit information on vulnerabilities for particular companies, receive payment, et cetera. Shanghai Jiaotong University is a cybersecurity program run and co-located on a Chinese military base in Shanghai. Its hacking teams have been affiliated with the PLA since at least 2010. They continue to be affiliated, and they run their own APT Attack and Defense Testing Research Center. No idea what they do there. So to dig into the right-hand side, this is the program requirements for people participating in the CNNVD, the database affiliated with the intelligence services. You can see here that they have varying levels of support that are required to be a company participating in the CNNVD database. Tier 1 companies are the highest, Tier 3 or level 3 are the lowest, and here are the requirements for the first year. If you want to be a Tier 1 vulnerability company for the MSS, you have to employ at least 20 vulnerability analysis and discovery team. You have to submit 20 CVEs, at least 3 of which are critical. And you have to provide the MSS of advance notice of 5 critical vulnerabilities that are being exploited a year. So effectively, they sit themselves right on top of the private ecosystem and say, if you're aware of these vulnerabilities, if you find these vulnerabilities, you have to let us know. And they, even require how many people you employ to do that work. But once you're into the program, the requirements for renewing your membership or maintaining your membership change. They want you to actually produce 35 vulnerabilities each year if you are to remain in level 1, all the way down to 5 vulnerabilities a year in level 3. You can see here the other requirements for communicating with CNNVD. They want you to energetically participate and make sure that you please respond to all of those emails from the NICE intelligence officers. We pulled together the list of companies that are participating in the system. We put them into their respective tiers, and then we did the math based on the minimum requirements to participate. And that led us to at least 1,190 researchers in the private sector of China are submitting vulnerabilities to the security services. They're meant to produce nearly 2,000 vulnerabilities a year. And of those, about 141 are supposed to be critical severity. Experts in the room would note that there are clear incentives to overinflate the criticality of the vulnerabilities that are being submitted, et cetera. But suffice to say that they're producing vulnerabilities for offensive hacking teams. But to go back to the naming conventions, this is one software vulnerability. You can see here on the left-hand side that CNNVD published it first. So this is April of 2021. The organization under China CERT in the middle, CNVD, published in May. And then it was received a CVE in our systems in December of that year. So that's an 8-month gap between original publication by Chinese intelligence services, again, online, you can find this, to when it was issued a CVE. And you'll notice in the naming conventions that these are not easily disambiguated. They're not designed to be easy for cross-referencing. That is not the point of the naming conventions. And it's probably not on purpose. It's probably just bureaucratic drift, the lack of coordination across agencies, something that participants in the room should be familiar with. And that's the state of the situation before 2021. So that was all before new regulations went into effect. In 2021 to today, the new system looks like this. The old system you can see on the right-hand side. I've added in red, helpfully, so you can track the vulnerabilities. But the new system's on the left-hand side. And the new system requires researchers and companies that are operating in PRC to provide their vulnerability information to the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, MIIT. They're at the top of the org chart in that circle. And they created a new vulnerability collection system. The regulations were put out by that ministry, the MIIT, the Ministry of Public Security, and the Cyberspace Administration of China. They were published in July of 2021, and they were implemented in September of that year. The regulations require that anyone, quote, doing business in China is subject to these requirements. You are not allowed to disclose a vulnerability unless you provide it to the MIIT database, which you should do within 48 hours if you're a researcher, and are required to do if you're a company and you learn of a vulnerability in your products within 48 hours and you're, quote, doing business in China. There's a gag rule on the discussion and publication of vulnerabilities or proof of concepts unless there is a patch available, which means there is a requirement for coordination between researchers and the company in order to produce a patch so that it can be talked about publicly. And if there is no patch, you're not going to talk about that vulnerability. That's the rule. And we see that this is handled in a pretty expansive or broad application of the rules. 2016 cybersecurity law lays out the punishments that are utilized under these regulations. So Log4j and Alibaba, I'm sure we're all familiar with that. There's an instance in which the CISA review board put out a report about Alibaba's involvement in Log4j. There was speculation at the beginning of the Log4j incident. Am I good to keep going? Okay. speculation at the beginning of the Log4j incident that there wasn't really a reason that China could punish this researcher at Alibaba for not having submitted the vulnerability. It wasn't an Alibaba product. They did not have jurisdiction to do so, et cetera. It turned out, according to state media, that Alibaba was punished. They were removed, actually, from the vulnerability sharing platform pursuant with China's cybersecurity law, Article 62. You can see there it's highlighted where the rules say that they can remove you from the database for not participating in it. And in addition to things that are not within your purview or not your responsibility because it's not your company's product, we've seen them roll out the regulation to cybersecurity competitions inside of China. This is from Tianfu Cup. If you can read Mandarin, then rule number 7 would tell you that if you find a vulnerability and you plan to use it in the Tianfu Cup competition, that you are required to submit that vulnerability to the government. And if you've not submitted it to the government, don't worry, the government will be at the competition to collect it from you, as can the companies whose products are vulnerable. And so they've gone ahead and they've actually rolled this out to a competition that's not run by the government. It is run by a number of private sector companies, et cetera. It has some oversight functions via the government. We know from the recent iSoon leaks, which was a contract hacker for the Ministry of Public Security in China, the leaks that happened earlier this month or last month, whenever that was, that even before this law went into effect, that hackers for the government in this ecosystem were receiving vulnerabilities from this competition. That was reported by MIT Technology Review. A particular vulnerability went from the competition to the next day being weaponized against Uyghurs in Xinjiang on their mobile devices. Those leaked iSoon chat logs back that up and say, hey, can we get the vulnerabilities from that competition? And somebody else at the company goes, no, they actually go to the Jiangsu MSS Bureau, so we can't get it. They already have them. So the new system on the left-hand side has 5 front-facing databases. These are actually all subsidiaries of one, which is called the NVDB. That's the 3rd, 5th, or 7th acronym I've thrown at you today. Suffice to say, it's basically all one database. They just have different websites for it. It's the same login. If you have a login, you can get into all of them, et cetera. But they do have different reporting authorities or oversight functions. So you can see that they have a database for internet-connected vehicles, one for mobile applications and software, one for hardware and software that's used by the government. Let's see what the other 2 are. ICS products, and then general product vulnerabilities. Under the regulations put in place in 2021, the rules say that the vulnerabilities at least have to go to the Ministry of Public Security's 3rd Bureau, which you can see up there at the top. And they also make their way to the voluntary database, CNVD, right there in the middle. The value of this report is to show that this dotted line exists and that those vulnerabilities actually make their way not only to the Civilian Intelligence Service, but also to the military. That is substantiated by this helpful index of participants in that vulnerability system, the voluntary one in the middle of the last chart. These people receive information from the new mandatory database, and that includes a military SIGINT institution under the Strategic Support Force, the military contractor Beijing Tianrong, the 13th Bureau of the MSS located in Beijing. There are bureaus all over PRC. Shanghai Jiaotong University, again, a university whose professors and academic emails have been tied to campaign infrastructure for Chinese military campaigns, runs a research center for them, as well as a number of companies that are in this list who are also part of that intelligence services support groups. So on this list, the people who receive all the mandatory vulnerabilities, many of them have offensive missions or support offensive missions in the course of their work. I'm highlighting here the Beijing 13th office. The MSS has been particularly focused on finding and cultivating access to vulnerabilities globally. In 2017, China and the Ministry of Public Security required researchers to begin submitting proposals so that they could leave the country and talk about their vulnerability research. So if you want to go to Pwn to Own and you're a researcher in the PRC, you have to submit paperwork in order to leave the country. You have to get approval to do that. And that aligns with the attitudes of people who are making policy in China on this topic. There are quotes from the head of Qihu 360, large cybersecurity company in China, referring to vulnerabilities as a natural resource. He compares it to coal and timber, and that this natural resource belongs to China. It's a naturally endowed country. It is imbued upon China that these vulnerabilities are within its borders. And so you don't actually get to go leave the country, cash in on that research you did. That belongs here with us. And so the regulations put into effect are based in part that idea. One of the oversight functions, or one of the oversight organizations of this new database is the China Software Testing Center. The China Software Testing Center serves the military, serves the intelligence services, has an ICS laboratory, has a special purpose laboratory whose website I can't get to work outside of China. It has a subsidiary entirely dedicated to military civil fusion, and it receives or it produces classified assessments on US national labs. On the right-hand side, in Mandarin, at the bottom of the screen, is an org chart, or a map, excuse me, of an institution. This is a map reproduced of Idaho National Labs' SCADA testbed. On this map, it identifies classified meeting locations. It identifies a SCIF, identifies a room in which people can have classified conversations via telecommunications, phone calls, etc. It shows where the cybersecurity testbed is. This was in a book published by the China Software Testing Center. Again, a recipient of the vulnerabilities submitted through that mandatory system, now being utilized by the offensive services. The China Software Testing Center is probably one of the places where vulnerabilities go to grow up, to become wonderful, beautiful tools for offensive hacking teams. They employed 2,000 software experts in testing and evaluation, many of them with graduate degrees in a relevant field. They certify technology for government and military use. So when the PLA wants to procure a particular weapon system, et cetera, these are the people who test that weapon system for known vulnerabilities, make sure it functions appropriately, et cetera, that it's not a gigantic piece of crap with a missile strapped to it. They also do pen testing, and they do pen testing on the civilian intelligence services. So if you can think of the A, level of trust required, and B, the level of competency to ask an outside institution as an intelligence service, could you do our pen test? That's where the China Software Testing Center falls in. And then finally, they have an interesting address overlap in southern China with this China China Science and Technology Conversion Center. It's got 10-foot walls, razor wire on top, trees all the way around, no fence, or no naming placards on the fence outside. But the document at the bottom right-hand side, if you were to open it and go through all 150 pages, is basically a wish list of technology that China is asking its universities to develop. And the inputs for that request come from private companies. So you don't see the names of the companies in the request, but you just see technology company located in Guangzhou wants a self-driving car, right? And that organization shares an address with that organization. And so if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So what can we observe about the impact of the regulations? We know that they're going to offensive teams. We know that they are making their way to institutions with offensive missions. But is the impact observable to us on the outside? In 2018, this is the ICS vulnerability data from the CNVD. Again, voluntary database affiliated with China CERT, not explicitly affiliated with the military or the intelligence services, but this is the pass-through organization. CNVD in 2018 had 100 and some odd ICS vulnerabilities, we'll call it. Pay attention to that Y chart, or the Y axis rather, it'll change. 2019, another 100 and something, maybe 200. We're clearing 100 in the month of December. 2020, same thing, 150, 200 vulnerabilities. And then that law is announced. And the ICS vulnerabilities coming out of this database, the one that's meant to publish vulnerability information for public consumption, stops. And so if you're in the room and you work at a company with ICS or OT products, I would ask you, review your internal data. See if you can disambiguate who was submitting to us before 2021, who is affiliated with an institution in the PRC that's not submitting anymore. Maybe they're still submitting. You would be one of the lucky ones to still be receiving information from them. But the implication here is that the talent and the people behind this vulnerability production didn't go away. They got sucked into the new mandatory reporting system. But if those vulnerabilities were patched, if the company knew about the vulnerability and it was patched, we would expect to see public data about that still. We would expect the company to release a patch. There may be a CNMVD tag associated with it, or at least a CVE, but the question is, why don't we see that data if those companies are receiving the information that is ostensibly meant to be passed to them? Again, this is just a composite view of that ICS drop-off. So, what does Microsoft say about this? In 2022, this is the year after, and at the last conference I did this at, I didn't have this shirt in time. It arrived like 4 days late. China, am I right? So this is from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report in 2022. And the important line for this audience is that they attribute as likely, not certain, not high confidence, but as likely, that the increase in vulnerability exploitation or zero-day exploits by PRC-affiliated hacker groups that year could be attributed to the impact of the law. And based on the data we reviewed just for ICS systems, I think the answer is yes. So I'm going to take us inside of what the reporting structure for these databases look like. Again, this was facilitated by, I think it's pronounced Sources and Methods. And this is the vulnerability submission page for the centralized database under the new reporting requirements. So again, MIIT, Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. This is the database they run, the NVDB. All 5 of those sub-products report up into this database. It's interoperable, single sign-on, the whole thing. So they want to know, does your vulnerability have a name? Does it have a CVE associated with it yet? Is that vulnerability original to you or not? What industry is it affiliated with? Could you provide your email and your last name and your phone number? That would be really cool if we could contact you or find you. It's got the vulnerability type and the vulnerability summary. And as we make our way down the page, there's additional spots for you to put in as much information as possible, basically. If you have a proof of concept for why this is a vulnerability, you can go ahead and give us that code. That would be great. If there's any associated URLs where other people have done this research, please provide that as well. Are there any remediation steps available for this vulnerability? And if you have any other documentation you want, you can attach it. Here with the internet connected vehicles, criticality, type, manufacturer, vuln description, impacted product, or publisher, etc. Please provide steps to discover the vulnerability with as much detail as possible. And if there's steps for remediation, that would be great too. Again, another database. Is the vulnerability original? Is it public? What's the location of the business? Can we contact you? Please provide specific information about how to trigger this vulnerability. And then down here at the bottom, is this published? Has anyone attached the CVE, a CNNVD, or a CNVD associated with this vulnerability? Up here on the left-hand side, give you time to read that. please provide as much detailed information as possible about how to trigger this vulnerability. If you want to include a video, feel free to do that, but please make sure to annotate that video so we can understand what's going on. We can figure out how to trigger that vulnerability. It'd be awesome. In the course of making our way through the portal for people to submit these vulnerabilities, there's a section where you fill out the company, you fill out the product that the vulnerability is associated with. Unfortunately, given the design of the website, it's not easy to identify all of the companies for which vulnerabilities exist, but you can see down here on that left-hand side, there are 3,000 some odd companies listed within the database. I've went through to Microsoft, Apple, et cetera. The level of detail on which products are vulnerable is pretty poor. For Apple, it just says Mac OS. Windows has, I think, 2 different versions in there. And Microsoft itself has 5 different entries, which tells me that the inputs to that line are not standardized in any way. They're not disambiguated. And so that 3,000 number is probably overinflated, different way that people put in the company name. And then we get another naming convention, CSVD. CSVD was designed by one state-owned enterprise, which is associated with the military. It's called CASIC, C-A-S-I-C, as well as a company from the private sector. And they produced both a book, a handbook, and an automated, quote, automated system to produce an evaluation for vulnerabilities that are submitted, and they tag it with CSVD. And CSVD is not meant for external collaboration outside of at least one of these databases. We don't know if CSVD applies to all 5 of those databases under the MIIT, but we know at a minimum that there is a new designation called CSVD. And they use this naming convention internal to the database. I didn't blur this out, by the way. This is from a how-to guide that was helpfully located on their website. So CSVD and the contents of the database that it's associated with were so sensitive that they decided to blur out the rest of this information. And then provide an example at the top. They just stuck a bunch of X's in there. And if I'm not mistaken, it's a SQL injection. So what does this mean for everybody on the outside of the PRC? If you're a company operating in China and they're asking you to submit vulnerabilities, now you know where they're going. If you're a company operating in China and you stopped receiving vulnerabilities, you know where they went. What can you do? But CNVD, the organization in the middle of that chart, the one whose membership lists include the Civilian Intelligence Service, the military, other associated entities, they have a partnership with a number of other certs, 33 of them. We don't know to what extent or how this partnership is shaped. We don't know if it includes data sharing, access, emergency response. The contours are unclear. And so I asked the organization, who was participating in the system? Who are you partnering with internationally? And they emailed me back and they said, yeah, we're not going to tell you, but you can go to our homepage. You can just follow that link. So unfortunately, we don't really know the extent to which China CERT is working with other national certs. We don't know what type of data is being shared. We don't know the value, the operational value of that data, et cetera. But it's safe to say that they are interested in getting as much as possible. This was picked up by Wired back in September when the report came out. And this piece by Andy Greenberg kind of details a number of companies that were in the appendix as foreign firms that were participating in one of these databases. And so if you're in the room, you work at a product company, you're operating in the PRC, there's a good chance that in some future iteration of these membership lists, your company may be listed. And we'll just leave it here that companies participating in the system are meant to provide a bunch of information, but having spoken with a number of companies operating in China, I don't think it's fair to say that all of them are energetically participating in the system. So I'll stop here and I'll open it up for questions. Andy the mic.
Sure. Okay. Yep. Thanks. I came in a bit late, but I had a question about. So there was the die-off in the ICS reports, and I think you also commented on sort of the lack of evidence of those vulnerabilities presumably being fixed or not. Did that also apply to sort of Chinese within PRC companies as well, or was that outside of PRC companies who were affected by the inability to fix at that point?
So the ICS data includes companies that are producing goods inside of China, including China-based companies. And so their data would be reflected in that drop-off as well. As would there's another graphic in the full report that's not on this slide, but you can see the same type of drop-off in general product vulnerability reporting as well.
That seems, are they not harming their own company's security then? Or are those firms silently patching and not advise? Do you know what's happening? If I had a government program, I would want to protect my own companies and harm the outsiders, right?
Yeah, totally. So part of the vulnerability databases, we can get back to it here. At least one of the vulnerability databases under this new system, the mobile application vulnerability database, actually has a working group associated with some state-owned enterprises. And if a vulnerability for your mobile application is submitted and you don't patch it in an appropriate amount of time, they don't identify what an appropriate amount of time is. If you don't fix it, they'll just show up to your offices and help you with it. And so they do care about patching some vulnerabilities. Specifically, it's unclear how those resources are distributed across these 5 databases. Given that each of them kind of coordinates to a different oversight body, it is likely specific to that ministry or that bureau, or whoever is responsible for the oversight, as to when and how those things are patched.
So I always really like these talks because my background's in threat intelligence, but I'm now in PCERT that works at a multinational corporation. So my question for you is, this information is interesting, but what recommendations do you have for those of us that are on the ground that are handling potential vulnerability reports coming out of China? Like what should we do with this information? Like what are some of your recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're getting vulnerability reports out of China, be thankful for that. Build relationships with those people and make sure that you continue to facilitate access into that environment, because it's not, do not take for granted that you're still receiving those reports. It's very nice that you're able to do so. Building out that relationship is important. If you operate in the PRC and you go through, whatever internal data you have, and you see that those reports have dropped off, go back and try to identify the people who submitted those vulnerabilities. They probably didn't lose that expertise that allowed them to find vulnerabilities in the past. Maybe you have to pay your bug bounty program. Maybe you have to, come up with some additional lines of funding, et cetera. But you can facilitate a relationship with the researchers in China who are submitting into this database mandatorily, and continue to make your products more secure. So those would be 2 things to engage with researchers. You can have a strategy for the way that you qualify items that are meant to be reported into this database. So if you're a large product company, or you have any number of goods that you're selling in the international market, if you had a model that was sold everywhere except for China, and you had a model that was sold in China, and let's call these functionally equivalent but different for legal reasons, then you could only submit vulnerabilities for the product sold in the PRC. That's the product that the market cares about, that the regulators ostensibly care about. And so if you limited your submissions into this system only to those products that are being sold there, that would be a good way to be compliant to the extent that's required. But I'm also happy to talk when I'm not being reported about how else you can go about that.
So you mentioned the vulnerabilities that are discovered in the China database system. If you're a multinational company, are there any China regulations that restrict the exporting of vulnerability data from your subsidiaries in China outside the borders of China?
No, you can move your own vulnerability data out of the country without issue.
Is there any restrictions on where the scanning devices should need to be located?
I'm
Does it
sorry,
have-
can you say that one more time?
This, if you're using a vulnerability scanner, does it have to be native to inside China, or can it be external also?
I don't think that there are specific rules about how that's executed. Yeah, I would just talk to your implementation teams about the best way to go about it. I mean, you'll depends on where your products are located. But I would say it's probably safer to be running that from inside of PRC. Just because on the off chance you make somebody upset, you don't want to have, you just don't want to have to deal with upset bureaucrats, period. But yeah, no, there's no regulations around that from my understanding. I can just hand this back to him.
Can I just confirm something I think you said earlier? My vague Google Translate read of some of this stuff that's probably out of date was that an individual researcher was perhaps not required to submit, but if the researcher, maybe it was required to tell the company and the company was required to submit. I think you said that may not be the case. The researcher has to also submit directly to the government. Can you clarify that arrangement? Yeah.
Yeah, so happy to clarify that. Good question. So this is legal advice from the Huayun law firm in China. On the right-hand side, you can see the image there. If you're an individual researcher, you do not have to submit vulnerabilities to this database. But if you are an individual researcher and you know about a vulnerability, you can only tell the company, period. You can't publish about it. You can't hype up the severity. You can't publish a proof of concept. You can only tell that company. So you can decide to tell them or not. But once that company is aware of it, they have 48 hours. Yeah.
Great talk. Quick question. Is there any financial motivation to submit these like what we do in the US for EU for bug bounty programs? In addition to, it seems like they try to rule a little bit by like really stern policy, but is there any financial motivation to submit these as well?
Yeah. So companies inside of the PRC pay out bug bounties, just like companies outside of China do. So that's kind of the brilliance of this collection system, is that the private companies are still incentivizing research through compensated bug bounty programs, through competitions like this, where money is handed out as part of your awards, et cetera. And the PRC government is able to collect those vulnerabilities without actually having to pay for any of the incentives to do that work. And so, yes, the incentives are still paid out. There's some regulations from the Ministry of Public Security that pay homage to, like, you're not supposed to inflate the prices of vulnerabilities when the government's involved, which is like, I don't know how you measure that. I don't think that they have like a pricing analyst to figure that out. I don't know how they'd go about it. But there are, companies in the private sector, as well as competitions that pay for and incentivize this type of program. These databases right here, the partner databases, Butian, which is under Tianxin, which is a cybersecurity company, and Volbox, which is another bug bounty program, both pay out rewards. You can still submit to these databases on the right-hand side on a voluntary basis after you submit to the mandatory system. And on the mandatory systems website, they actually still encourage you to voluntarily submit to these other systems. And so there's some bureaucratic issues with the implementation of the regulations. It's clear that you do have to participate in the mandatory system, and this voluntary system on the right-hand side has more question marks over it now. But the paid part of the ecosystem is still incentivizing people to do that work and still participating. Anyone else?
This is outside of your expertise. That's totally fine. But I'm curious, just in terms of how vulnerabilities are rated and scored and considered, are there any major differences between how it's done in China and the PRC and how it's done elsewhere? I mean, do they still have CVSS vectors, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. See if I can find the criticality ranking. Yeah. So this is one of the input forms. Again, this one's for the internet connected vehicles. You can self-assign the criticality of a vulnerability. They are using the CVSS system. The contracted CSVD has its own system for calculating like the severity of a vulnerability. It's like a 200+ page document that I wasn't going to read for that. But it's available online if you know you have the time, interest, want to pay somebody to translate it, et cetera. This is the only instance in which I found them applying a different severity ranking system or grading system. But the input forms for the databases are, noted here, self-evaluated CVSS. Anyone else? Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.